Rod Porter from King's AgriSeed back again. We're in a cornfield now. Talk a little bit about cover crop in some of our row crop production. So obviously you can see corn is a pretty vigorous growing crop, very competitive, gets tall, tends to shade in between the rows when it gets big. That is actually one of the sort of background methods of weed control, is the shading. But in trying to use cover crops in our row crops, the row crops don't come off until later in the fall. So establishing and working with cover crops in conjunction with corn or soybeans can be challenging. How can we do that here in New York when our season is limited and we've got our cash crop here that we need to focus on and get that harvested first? So this field actually has been interseeded with a cover crop in the standing corn. So the idea is that we're trying to establish this cover crop while the corn is still growing, so that later on when the corn crop comes off, our cover crop is already established and can begin to flourish and do the kind of job that we want it to do with, preventing erosion, sequestering extra nutrients left over from the corn crop, doing some soil compaction relief, and those kinds of things. But this corn was planted around the 20th of May. And this actually is some organic production. So this corn was cultivated with a row cultivator. So we had some loose soil in between the rows, and we simply broadcasted the seed after the last cultivation. And so we had some loose soil for that seed to get in good contact with, and then we just were relying on a little bit of rain to kind of firm that in the soil and get it to germinate. So that's been a little challenging this year, but we did succeed in this field of establishing that cover crop. In a no-till situation or conventional production, you'd want to be very conscious of what herbicides are you using on the corn. If your intention is to establish a cover crop in that corn, you need to pick herbicides that have a short half-life and are not going to hinder your cover crop from germinating and growing underneath that corn canopy. The other thing is seed to soil contact is very important. And if we're no-till or just even conventional tillage where we're not cultivating, we don't have loose soil between the rows. So we need to somehow get that seed incorporated into the soil. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that people run into. There is equipment that's been developed out there. There's an interseeder drill that's been developed where you can actually drill in that cornfield. You're just missing drill row units where the corn row is, so you're not running that over. That can work very good. The challenge with that is it's hard to cover a lot of acres very fast. So some other companies have developed some airflow units, much wider, blowing the seed down in between the row, and then some sort of like a rolling basket or scratcher running on the ground to help incorporate that. So there are methods to get it done. In this case, you are pretty dependent on having some specialized equipment to get it done, or a custom operator in the area that has that can do it for you. So very beneficial to be able to establish that cover crop while the corn is growing, because our season just isn't long enough to do a good job afterwards. If you're a dairy producer and you're harvesting silage, you have a better window of opportunity, potentially put a cover crop after that silage comes off, and many farmers do that. But in cash crop grain harvest, it's just too late in the season. So this is a good method in corn. In soybeans, we tend to look at systems where we might try to put a cover crop seed out there at the end of the season, like just before leaf drop on the soybeans. Something simple like winter rye. We can even maybe put some other species in there too. Can get established when those leaves drop and actually provide a little bit of mulch to get that seed started. But yet that cover crop doesn't grow enough before harvest to be a hindrance in harvesting the soybeans. So I often get questions, can I plant a cover crop earlier in my soybeans? And my answer is absolutely not. So if the cover crop is successful and the beans don't outcompete it, then you're going to have green stuff in the soybeans when you're trying to combine, and that's no good. Otherwise, the soybeans are going to be too competitive. It's not going to be successful, and you wasted your money. So Really, in soybeans, the only time is after harvest or just prior to harvest at leaf drop time. So, again, species selection depends on what your goals are. When you're interseeding in corn, there are species that work well and can tolerate shade, and there's others that don't. So any of the small grains do not work well. They don't tolerate the shade. It's harder to get them established because they really should be in the soil, like an inch deep. The things that do work well are some of the clovers and ryegrass. And we have varying success with radish. I've used radish fairly successfully, but I know others have had challenges establishing and keeping that radish alive while the canopy is competing with it. So clover is probably the most foolproof in terms of tolerating shade and getting established. And we might look at medium red clover, crimson clover, even some white clovers. So, again, goal is to preserve the soil, alleviate some compaction, sequester nutrients and carbon for future crops. And the key in getting good establishment is good seed soil contact. The other is that even though those species that I mentioned can survive in the shade, they need a little bit of light to get established initially. So seeding early at the V4 to V5 leaf stage on corn is the best timing so that it can get established when there's a little bit of light still getting through the canopy, and then it can then sit there and survive in the shade for the rest of the season. So earlier planting tends to be a little bit better successful. You might think that in a dry year, you're less successful at establishing that cover crop, but oftentimes the corn doesn't canopy quite so quick because it's not growing so fast and actually leaves enough light that you do get reasonable establishment in a dry year, as long as you got good seed soil contact. In a wet year, the canopy just is so dense that the shading is too dense, and we don't get good establishment sometimes in a wet year. Initially, you might think the opposite, but that's usually the way it works. Let me just explain a little bit more about what we did here. So this is organic corn production. And if you're looking, you see a few weeds out in here. So we're not using a specialized piece of equipment to establish our cover crop here. Because we cultivate with a row cultivator that's loosening the soil and controlling weeds in between the rows, we have some nice loose soil after we cultivate. And we're just broadcasting the seed out there with a broadcaster. And because of the loose soil, that seed can get in good contact with the soil. Just one rain helps to firm it in a little bit and helps it get started in germinating. But in a conventional farming situation or a no-till situation, you actually need some piece of equipment that's going to get that seed into good contact with the soil. So broadcasting in no-till or a conventional farming situation where you don't cultivate is not going to be successful.
Okay.